It's 7 o'clock. This is a Sky News question and answer special on the war in Ukraine. All through the day, we've been gathering your questions and we'll be doing our very best to answer them in the next hour. But first, the headlines. Curfew in Kiev. The mayor restricts movement around the city as he prepares for difficult moments ahead.
Everyone is angry. I talk to the people. They don't want to leave.
Российский премьер подчеркнул, надо усилить сотрудничество в рамках союзного государства.
Fine for her defiance, the Russian journalist who disrupted primetime television news to speak out against the war appears in court. Boris Johnson defends his trip to Saudi Arabia and says Western nations must not be hooked on Russian oil and gas.
Vladimir Putin over the last years has been like a pusher, feeding an addiction in Western countries to his hydrocarbons.
The UK sanctions hundreds more wealthy Russians, including the former President Dmitry Medvedev. Good evening. Welcome to a Sky News question and answer special on the war in Ukraine. Coming up, the military expert and former Director General of the Royal United Services Institute, Professor Michael Clarke, will be here throughout the next hour to answer your questions on the conflict. But first, the mayor of Kiev has told Sky News that the capital is the heart of Ukraine and will be defended in its darkest hours. Vitaly Klitschko has warned that the next few days will be a test for the city's defences and has imposed a 35-hour-long curfew from tonight until Thursday. 5 people were killed in Russian attacks in residential areas this morning. Sky special correspondent Alex Crawford reports now from Kiev.
This was another step up in attacks inside the capital. More homes hit, more lives lost. They've been so resilient. But this is really taking a toll. Tears, yes, but a steely toughness too. We'll keep ourselves together, he says, tears on his cheeks. We will remain strong. The city was roused early again with multiple strikes in all points around the capital, and they're expecting a lot more over the next few days. The sound of battle is unavoidable now in the capital, but this army chaplain called it an unequal fight. This isn't war, he says. This is international terrorism. War is armies against armies, but when armies attack civilians, this is international terrorism. The mayor called it a dangerous moment and immediately slapped a 35-hour curfew on the capital.
How would you describe the spirit of the Ukrainian people and your feeling about this?
The spirit right now, everyone is angry. I talk to the people. They don't want to leave. In this activity, bring much more energy to everyone, and everyone understand, don't want to leave, want to defend our city.
They are meeting this onslaught with fortitude, cleaning out their broken homes and just getting on with it. Some have sent their families and children outside Kyiv because they've known the Russian military was homing in on this city.
Oh, these are all the children's toys, the children's things all.
But the war has reached right into their living rooms and balconies now.
My parents still in Kiev, living on left bank of Kiev. My sister too. But we still there.
You're still here.
Yeah. And I'm not afraid. Because I know it's... I believe our victory.
The residents know their homes and their lives are collateral damage in the battle for this, the prize, their capital city. But they're not bowed.
I don't think I am brave, but I don't want to leave my city, I don't want to leave my country. And if it will need be, I will take a gun and go to fight and kill Russians.
The capital's mayor expects more of this and has warned that Russian activity is expected to substantially increase over the next 48 hours. And he's urged his fellow residents to be wary. He and his brother believe the Russian military is very close right now, and they've no intention of going anywhere.
You can throw a stone and hit a Russian soldier. I'm not even kidding.
And besides, he points out, they have increasingly few options now.
We have no other choice but defend our city, our capital, and our country. What is the other choice here? We didn't invade anyone. They came to our home and killing our men, women, and children.
There's a deepening frustration amongst Ukrainians as time runs out for any concrete outside help, with soldiers, civilians, and journalists being killed and injured.
This must be devastating for anyone who comes from this area. What are your thoughts about how much the international community is doing?
It is not just devastating. This is war. Behind me, a building where civilians were killed by the Russian rocket, and this is not just the first and not the last. It doesn't matter who you are on the Ukrainian soil now. With a press bench, a little girl, a boy, an adult, man or woman, or an old person, you're a target from Russia, from Russian army.
But so many of Kiev's residents refuse to be intimidated despite it all. Come and have coffee with us, she's saying to our crew.
When will you be open?
She takes barely a heartbeat to think about this. Soon, she says. Even with the Russian military closing in on them, their spirit seems unbreakable. Alex Crawford, Sky News in Kiev.
Well, now to the situation right across Ukraine, and another attempt to send aid into the besieged city of Mariupol appears to have been unsuccessful. However, the city council says 2,000 cars were able to leave the city. Russia says the entire Kherson region is now under their control. Forces are believed to be preparing to advance on Odessa next, Ukraine's crucial economic hub. More than 60 Russian airstrikes hit Kharkiv last night, and officials say Dnipro Airport's runway was destroyed in an attack. To the west, 19 people are now confirmed dead following a strike on a TV tower in the Rivne region. And the Red Cross reports buses with civilians on board have left the Sumy region today via humanitarian corridors. Well, Sky's Alistair Bunkle is in Lviv and joins me now. And Alistair, first of all, a high-level political delegation heading to the capital tonight.
Yeah, the leaders of Poland, Slovenia and the Czech Republic, fellow Eastern European states, have arrived in the capital, Kiev, this evening. They arrived here by train. They've come here despite the capital being under bombardment. I was speaking to a Ukrainian diplomat within the last few minutes, and she says that it is very, very noisy there at the moment. But they have come here in an active war zone to show an act of solidarity to the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zielinski, and to make sure that they see it for themselves. And I think that is something that we haven't seen from any Western leader for, well, I can't remember the last time that a Western leader went to a war zone like this, but it will hopefully, I imagine, shape their view of what is going on here when they can see and hear what's going on the ground, and we'll see how that shapes the EU's response to all this. The NATO Secretary-General as well speaking today, Jens Stoltenberg, warning about Russia's rhetoric around chemical and biological weapons. Russia has suggested that the United States is funding various biological labs across Ukraine, including 3 around this city of Lviv. And the fear is that that is a false flag, or at least they're laying the ground for a false flag operation.
They are making absurd claims about biological labs and chemical weapons in Ukraine. This is just another lie. And we are concerned that Moscow could stage a false flag operation, possibly including chemical weapons.
And Alistair, President Zielinski making some more comments about NATO today, of course, could have a bearing on the peace discussions.
Yeah, big time. Zelensky is saying that Ukraine has to accept that it's not going to become a member of NATO anytime soon. Now, anyone who knows the NATO membership process will say that has been evident for a long time, despite what President Putin has said about the threat of Ukraine wanting to join NATO. The fact is, if you want to join the alliance, you cannot have any border or territorial disputes, which means what has been going on in the Donbass region over the last 8 years would have prevented Ukraine from joining NATO anyway. Zelensky has, up till now, quite steadfastly maintained Ukraine's right to join NATO if it wanted to, but he's kind of changed his tune, and we wonder whether that is part of the negotiation, part of the diplomatic process that is going on behind the scenes, and whether it could form the pillar of some sort of ceasefire deal if he can try and convince the rest of Ukraine that joining NATO is not the be-all and end-all. Will that satisfy Vladimir Putin? Will that lead to Russian troops finally retreating from the country?
Alistair Bunkle in Lviv, thank you very much. Well, now, we have had hundreds of questions about the war in Ukraine, and the security and defence analyst Michael Clarke is here again with me to answer as many of them as we can. Welcome back, Michael. Good to see you. Let's dive straight in because there are so many people having so many concerns. And we start with Anne's question. There it is. And it's, well, pretty eternal question about this war. What will it take, if anything, for NATO to get involved militarily with the crisis? Because I suppose NATO is already involved, just not directly.
Absolutely. NATO is already deeply in this crisis. It's supplying Ukraine, pretty obviously, and it's doing all it can to reinforce its own borders and put pressure on the Russians and President Putin. What I suspect Anne is getting at is, will NATO troops go into Ukraine to fight? And what I guess her question may be about is, if Putin used chemical weapons, would that be a threshold that we would cross? And I think the answer is no. I mean, President Putin at the moment is trying to goad NATO into doing something so he can say, look, NATO is attacking me. He's trying to actually make NATO overreact, and NATO is being very careful to help as much as it can in Ukraine without overreacting and making this crisis
What
worse.
evidence have you noticed of that goading? Was that attack near the border with Poland? Was that part of it?
Well, he keeps threatening his nuclear forces. He's even threatening that there might be a nuclear spillage. Today, a Russian drone went into Polish territory and came out again. Another Russian drone went into Romanian territory, came out again. Carefully calculate, these are surveillance drones, they weren't armed, but both of them invaded NATO territory for a short time. And he's also made it clear that he will attack NATO convoys or NATO equipment once it's over the Ukrainian side of the border. The implication is he might even start to attack when it's on the Polish side of the border, which would be a huge challenge to NATO.
Indeed. And I suppose this includes a no-fly zone, which would have to be enforced by NATO aircraft. Yeah. Putin could then go back to the Russian people and say, see, I told you so, NATO is attacking Russia.
Yes, he's been saying publicly since 2008 that NATO is a threat to Russia. And he's looking for evidence that he can show to people that, look, I was right. Look what they're now doing. So he's trying to extend this war. It's partly the old Hitlerian principle, actually, that the way to recover from one huge strategic blunder is to make another somewhere else. Because that throws everything up in the air, and as the cards land, you think you might get a better hand. And the danger is that President Putin's in a real mess with this war. He might try to retrieve it by making it into a bigger war so that he can manipulate it in some way.
OK, well, let's talk more about that NATO equipment that is being given in great quantities to Ukraine. And a question from Buster about the aircraft. Well, it was mentioned at the very start of the war. Is there any way Poland can get the MiG fighters to the Ukrainian Air Force? Now, we know that the Polish have tried this, but the Americans have rejected it.
Yeah. I mean, what Poland did this time last week is that they said, we'll send our MiG-29s to Ramstein, which is the biggest American base. We'll give them to the Americans. In Germany. And then the Americans can give them to the Ukrainians, and then the Russians can take it up with the Americans. The Americans didn't know about this. It's one of the few cases where NATO was not particularly united. It's the only case, really, so far. And the Americans immediately backed off. And the view is that it would provoke the Russians to the point where it would pull NATO in. So if NATO aircraft, as it were being flown by Ukrainian pilots in Ukrainian airspace, the Russians again might take that as an excuse to say, we can take action inside Poland because you've actually supplied your aircraft to our adversaries. I wouldn't rule it out as this crisis goes on, but for the time being, NATO is not going to have MiG-29s flying inside Ukraine.
Let's examine the issue now of, as we hear from NATO itself, rather than Putin getting less NATO, that's his ambition, he's going to get more NATO, and it's encapsulated in this next question coming up from Bob. There it is. How likely is it that Finland would apply to join NATO, and how would Russia respond? I mean, not just Finland, those non-NATO countries like Sweden. Of course, Finland's fought, a bit like Ukraine, fought Russia on its own in the past, the then USSR.
Famously, the Winter War of 1939-40, where they did incredibly well, but ultimately lost to Russian numbers. And Finland has pursued a very careful line ever since 1945 of being neither aligned one way or the other, being careful about what Russia thought, not provoking Russia, but being Western in every other respect. Finland has never wanted seriously to join NATO. In 2017, 53% of the population who were polled said, no, we don't want to join NATO. 2017. This year, 2 weeks ago, 53%, exactly the same number, saying now we do want to join NATO. Now, this time there was a bigger number of don't knows. There was about 18 and 19% don't knows. But the fact is there's been a swing in public opinion in Finland to say, actually, I think we do need to come into NATO at some point in the future. And Finnish politicians are going out of their way. I mean, one of the leaders of the opposition was writing only today in the Financial Times saying the time has come for us to come off the fence because Russia is not just a threat to us, it's a threat to European security. So the chances of Finland applying for NATO membership are now really quite high. So how do you like that, Mr. Putin?
Yeah, just that broader point about more NATO, whether more countries join or not. The fact is that whatever way this conflict lands, NATO is going to reinforce that eastern flank as much as it can over the next months and years.
It may not last, but Europe has rediscovered itself since the 24th of February. The EU has been far more effective than anyone thought likely. NATO has been far more united and cohesive and tough than anyone thought likely. Europe is a different animal this last 3 weeks. The challenge will be, will it still be a different animal in 6 months' time? We'll see. But at the moment, I think Mr. Putin, like most of the rest of us, to be honest, have been surprised by how strong the Western reaction has been and how quick and effective it has been.
Well, you touched there, Michael, on the fact that Putin might try to expand this conflict. So let's bring in, well, what was unthinkable, it seems, only a few weeks ago. Now it's certainly not the issue of the nuclear threats, the chilling nuclear threats made by Russia. And this from Carrie says, if Russia does hit the nuclear button, where are they likely to target? Would they initially be on the battlefield within Ukraine, so to speak, or would there be a first strike?
I think we have to say, Dermot, we are a long, long, long way from this. But
presumably in the Pentagon, throughout the capitals,
people worry about it.
NATO, but the planning is going on, is it?
Lenin famously said, nothing happens for decades, then decades happen in days. That's where we are now. So things are happening very quickly, but we're still a long way from this. Now, the Russians have a nuclear policy which integrates nuclear weapons right down to the lowest levels of their forces. We don't in the West. We keep our nuclear weapons quite separate to our forces. But the Russians use them on the battlefield, or they train to at least. So that if there were a nuclear use, it is overwhelmingly likely, if it were to happen, that it would be on the battlefield somewhere. It's plausible, if we're in this crazy world, that it might be on the battlefields of Ukraine, or it might be over the border in Poland or Romania, which would be an Article 5 triggering of NATO, and then we're into really serious.
But I mean, just this on the battlefield. I mean, it's a glib phrase, but there isn't actually a battlefield in Ukraine. We're not seeing massed armies of tanks fighting each other. It's a very complex war.
It is
fought in fields and bushes and forests.
That's right. I mean, and Russian nuclear weapons were designed as battlefield weapons for Russian armies that were moving forward in a more conventional way in Western Europe, and also to deter Western forces from using our slightly bigger and more developed nuclear forces, which are there's a big gap between our conventional and our nuclear. In Russia, there's no gap. If Russia were to use its strategic nuclear forces, its rockets and its submarine-launched weapons, then you're talking about wholesale nuclear war. And again, we are a long, long, long way from that.
Well, where are they likely to strike? But, the question then encapsulates, would they be likely to strike a major city from one of their now adversaries in NATO, one of the capitals?
Well, that would be a trigger for the closest the world has ever come to a straight nuclear war.
Well, let's follow on from that. And you touched on it again there, Michael, about the chain of command. And you can tell us about how it works in our country, in the United States as well. How does the chain of command work for Putin to authorise a nuclear attack? Who else would need to be involved and support this within Russia? I suppose Natasha is asking, can he more or less do it himself? Actually, is there a button on the desk?
Yeah, Natasha asks a very good question. There's two lines. If we were talking about battlefield nuclear weapons, because they're at low levels with ground forces, then the chain of command is quite a long one. So it's from Putin to the general staff, down to the nuclear control centres, down to the low levels of field commanders. So quite a lot of people have actually got to be involved in it. And on past experience, I think that those orders, if he gave them, wouldn't be obeyed in terms of tactical nuclear weapons. However...
Just expand on that, past experience. What is
in Able Archer was a famous case. 1983, it was a big mistake. The Western alliance gave the Russians the impression, because of a technical glitch, that an attack was building. The Russians took it really seriously, and they started to arm all their nuclear weapons because they were so anxious. This was October 83. And a colonel, Lieutenant Colonel Stanislav Petrov, disobeyed orders. He said, I don't believe it. I don't believe it. And he delayed long enough for them to find out that it was all a technical error. And there was a critical 40 minutes when Petrov said, I don't believe it. I am disobeying orders. He was the man who should have actually given the alert.
And if they had...
He was a colonel. He was low down. He was a colonel.
If they had armed the nuclear weapons, that's detected then by the United States and others, and who knows what happens.
We came very close to an accidental exchange of some sort in October 1983.
And you think that, it would rely on that if Putin gave the order? Now, you think there are those within the Russian hierarchy, the chain of command, who...
Yeah, because this is not a nuclear crisis. This is a crisis about something else. Cuba in 1962 was a nuclear crisis. It was about nuclear weapons, and there was a lot of tension in the nuclear forces on both sides. But this isn't. So I don't think his orders would be obeyed. I'm just guessing, obviously. But there is another element here, which I think Natasha may be thinking about, is that if Putin gave orders to his submarine commanders, if he were ever to launch a strategic nuclear attack on the West using his nuclear weapon submarines, which are out in the Atlantic most of the time, or some of the time, that order goes straight from the president to the submarine commander. It doesn't pass through anybody else. So in that case, there might be a bigger case for saying maybe his orders would be carried out. Would rather depend on the submarine commander.
I think on that note, Michael, we need to take a break to draw a breath and absorb all that. You're watching the Sky News question and answer special on the war in Ukraine. As the Russian journalist who interrupted a state TV news programme last night is fined for her protest against the war, will answer your questions about how the conflict is being reported in Russia.
I love my job because I get to do something that is contributing to a better future.
Welcome back. Now, Marina Ovsyannikova, the Russian television news producer who staged an extraordinary anti-war protest live on national television last night, has appeared in a court in Moscow. Her act of defiance during a prime-time news bulletin came at great risk to her personal freedom under Russia's new censorship laws. The Kremlin said her actions amounted to an act of hooliganism, and she was fined about £200 or 30,000 rubles. This report from our Moscow correspondent, Diana Magnay, contains some flash photography.
This was an astonishing act of courage. 5 seconds on state TV that millions will have watched. Don't believe the propaganda, they are lying to you here, the banner says. And this message recorded in advance.
И это ожерелье на моей шее как символ того, что Россия должна немедленно остановить братоубийственную войну.
48 hours later, Marina Ovsyannikova emerged from court. Her punishment, a relatively small fine, but there may be more to come.
Я провела буквально 2 суток без сна, больше 14 часов длился допрос, и мне не давали ни связаться с моими родными, ни близкими, мне не предоставляли никакой юридической помощи.
We asked the man often called Russia's chief propagandist, the head of media empire Россия сегодня, what he thought of it.
И она представляет очень маленький процент людей в России. Запад, конечно, делает из нее героиню. Но для нас это не значит ничего. Потому что вот эта война, которая сейчас идет, эти военные действия, для России это духовный выбор.
Ukraine is more united than it has ever been. And there are people in their basements with the bombs falling on them, calling their parents in Russia. And their parents don't believe them because it's not shown on state TV. What do you make of that?
Я абсолютно не согласен с этим. Потому что на Украине сложилась ситуация, когда националистическое меньшинство терроризирует нормальное, здоровое большинство. Это все пропагандистский трюк.
2 other Russian state TV journalists announced their resignations today. One of them a long-time presenter who'd left the country a few days ago, and the other a foreign correspondent who was already based in Europe. Because if you oppose what Russia is doing, it is safer to be outside the country than in. Protesting inside Russia tends not to end up well. This woman is holding up a sign which literally says just 2 words.
Вас уже задерживают.
Enough to see her taken in. And then this woman too, who was explaining how she opposed the protests. 15,000 people detained since Putin moved into Ukraine.
In such circumstances like we have nowadays, it's really difficult to be completely free and do whatever you want, unfortunately.
I think we need peace, of course. It's my own position.
That is a position shared across the world, just not perhaps by the one man who could make it happen. Diana Magnay, Sky News, Moscow. Well, in that battle to get the truth out, Ukraine's President Zielinski has been using some of his video messages to directly address the Russian people. Speaking last night, he thanked the woman who interrupted that Russian TV broadcast and encouraged all Russians to dissent against the invasion. Now, this is some of what he said.
You will take lives. There are a lot of you, but your life will also be taken. But why should you die? What for? I know that you want to survive. We intercept your conversations. We hear what you really think about this senseless war, about this disgrace, and about your state.
President Zielinski there. Well, let's examine now then the potential for disquiet about the war to spread within Russia itself with our defence and security analyst Michael Clarke once again. And we're obviously going to put your questions to him about that, plenty of them. As you can see, this from Andrew. Two parts to this, I suppose. Andrew asks, how likely are we to see an uprising of the Russian people against the Kremlin as sanctions take hold of the country and they start to see through the propaganda that they're being subjected to through the Russian media? Well, let's talk, Michael, then, first of all, about that top part. How likely to see an uprising in Russia against the Kremlin, against Putin, particularly with the economic pain that Russia's been subjected to?
I mean, the economic pain is certainly having an effect. As of, I think, last night, 375 Western firms have pulled out of Russia, and so people notice. About 1 million people have been made unemployed in the last 3 or 4 days because those firms have pulled out. So this is beginning to have an impact. On the other hand, Putin is not that unpopular with ordinary Russians, particularly outside the cities, because they think he's restored Russia. He's got over some of the humiliations they felt in the 1990s. And there is actually, and they blame the West. They blame the West for their problems, as if they're being blamed and sanctions are really unjust. There's no mechanism for any sort of popular uprising. If there is to be some movement against Putin, which I believe there will be, it won't come from the majority of people. It will come from the elites in the cities who see more easily what is going on. It'll come from the security services and the military who are being blamed at the moment for what's gone wrong. I mean, already quite a lot of FSB senior officers appear to have been arrested. That's the old KGB. The SVR, which is the equivalent of MI6, are being blamed. The GRU, which is military intelligence, are really being blamed. And the military are being blamed for not being better. So the three big security services and the military and some of the oligarchs, some of the kleptocrats and some of the elites in the cities, that's the group from which some revolt against Putin, if it arises, is likely to arise, not from a popular uprising, I think.
So from within the institutions that are not that different, really, from the way the Soviet Union used to operate, the removal of Khrushchev and things like that. Then the big question is, what character of person do you get? Do we get a Democrat, a proper Democrat, or do we get Putin plus?
No, well, we probably get Putin minus because by whenever this happens, and, you know, I've been saying, I mean, this could happen in 3 months or it could happen in 3 years, but it will happen. And what we'll get is a Russia that's on its knees in some way when that does happen, economically much poorer. And so although we will get some sort of Putin clone of some sort, it won't be a Democrat. It may be a Putin clone who realises that they've got to change and they've got somehow to get back on terms.
And how does the West have to react then to this new leader whenever it happens? Very generously, sanctions removed,
on condition.
Money pumped in?
On condition. So the West has got to start thinking now. This is a time for all great strategists to come to the party. The West has got to start thinking now, what sort of Russia do we want to live with in 10 and 20 years' time? So let's think about that and then design a policy back from there as to what we're going to do when Putin disappears, which, as I say, might be quite soon, might be in a while. And Russia will be enfeebled to a fairly big extent when that happens. So how do we organise our policy to get the result we want in 10 and 20 years? OK,
plenty more questions to come. Michael, do stay with us. You're watching a Sky News question and answer special on the war in Ukraine, and we'll be going through your questions about Russia's military campaign next with our security and defence analyst, Professor Michael Clarke. Welcome back to this Sky News special on the war in Ukraine. Our defence and security analyst Michael Clarke is here with me to take a look at the questions now on the military strategies of Russia and Ukraine. So we start with this question from Howard. What are the key cities, Michael, that Russia needs to take to fulfil its military ambitions, and how do you rate their chances? And what does it tell us about the Russian strategy?
Yeah, well, the Russian strategy to begin with was to take the whole of Ukraine effectively in 3 days and mop up by the 8th of March. And here we are on 15th of March, and they haven't even reached square one yet. So the original strategy was to take all of the cities. That's clearly impossible. The fallback strategy might be to actually take the cities that are east of the Dnieper, so those are the cities that they're fighting in at the moment, so Chernihiv and Sumy and Kharkiv and so on, right down the coast to Mariupol, and create even annex them to Russia, and then create a puppet state to the west of the Dnieper, based on Lviv, cut it off from the sea by taking Odessa, and so have, as it were, an extension of Russian territory east of the Dnieper and a puppet state like Belarus west of the Dnieper. That's possible, but in my view, they still can't do it because you simply, I mean, even east of the Dnieper, that's 15 million people. You can't hold down that number of people with the number of troops the Russians have got. You can't.
And how important is Kiev to the strategy, taking Kiev?
They would have to occupy Kiev. Yeah, they can't leave Kiev out of it, and Kiev certainly couldn't be the capital of a rump Ukraine. It would have to be Lviv or somewhere that's not Kiev. That's the point, because Kiev is so much more important than Moscow in Slavic history. Kiev was founded in the year 482. It's 1,500 years old. It's 700 years older than Moscow. So you can't have Kiev as in a rump state, because that would be the real Ukraine.
But can you destroy Kiev in that analysis while you take it?
Well, you could lay it flat, the city of domes, one of the jewels in the crown of Slavic civilization. See the Russians reduce that to ashes would be appalling. And I don't think, Putin would never get over it. I don't think Russia would ever recover from that, to be honest.
And is the Ukrainian strategy the flip side of that then? Just defend these major cities, fight them to a standstill. You're not going to destroy the Russian army outright, but you could just hold them where they are.
Correct. I mean, the Ukrainians don't have enough to beat the Russian army in any obvious sense. They can't split them in half, they can't encircle them, they can't throw them out of the country. But they can fight them to a standstill, which is what they're doing in the three places. I mean, on the road to Odessa, in this north-south link-up they're trying to create, and around Kiev. Now, they can suffer an awful lot when they do. They might crack in formed units, but then they'll blend into the territorial units, 25 brigades, one in each region, and they'll fight and fight and fight. That seems to be the case. And so they can fight the Russians to a standstill and win politically.
Well, let's talk about reinforcements. And we've been hearing, haven't we, about the Russians bringing in more forces. And this from Mike. Could the introduction of Chechen and Syrian fighters in large numbers overwhelm the resistance? Well, we know the Chechens are already there, and there's talk of bringing in Syrian fighters who are experts in urban warfare.
Yeah.
Would that change the dynamic?
It won't have a huge strategic effect. It will increase the nastiness of the whole thing. Some of these people are not at all very nice people. They, belong to ultra groups of various sorts. They're experienced fighters. But, it's an inconvenient fact, Dermot, that the Ukrainians have got some very unpleasant people on their side. There's the Azov Brigade, who are defending Mariupol ferociously at the moment. That's a crowd of neo-Nazi white separatists, white supremacists. And there's the number 1 Dnieper Brigade, very similar. I mean, there are some very unpleasant groups in Ukraine that were in Ukraine. They do have a right-wing problem. And
Putin's amplified that. That's
exactly.
Part of his analysis.
It's a propaganda win for Putin, because he says, look, we're fighting these Azov people, these Azov brigades, look at them. And it's true. It's an inconvenient fact. But in war, my enemy's enemy is my friend. They're all Ukrainians now. As and when this war goes somewhere, whatever happens to Ukraine, they're going to have to deal with these somewhat unpleasant groups. It always happens. It happened in the Second World War all the time. Communists and right-wing fascists actually got together to oppose the Germans. And when the war came to an end, then they started fighting each other. That's an argument for tomorrow. But it is an unpleasant fact that there are, just as the Syrians and Chechens are coming into this war, so there are some really, one or two, unpleasant neo-Nazi groups fighting for the Ukrainians.
OK, yeah, we're talking about physical reinforcements there for the Russians. So let's talk now with this question about getting financial and military assistance. This from Stephen. Given the recent reports of Putin's approach to China for financial and military assistance, what action, in the event this assistance is provided, could the West take in response, which turns the spotlight on China, how to deter them.
Yes, I mean, the Americans are already saying very loudly in public and in private to the Chinese, don't do this. You know, don't get yourself involved with saving Putin. Be careful, because if you do, we really will sanction you. And you've seen now, in the last 3 weeks, how powerful Western sanctions really can be. I mean, nobody thought Western sanctions would be this powerful, but they are. And so that's what the Americans are saying. Now, the Chinese are having to think very carefully at the moment, because they already earlier this week, they denied aircraft parts to Russia, observing American sanctions. And so they linked in with that policy. At the same time, they defend Russia in the UN. They recycle these stupid Russian stories about biological and chemical weapons plants in Ukraine, which is pure rubbish, but the Chinese media recycles them. Xi Jinping is on the fence at the moment. He's pursuing a policy of what I call friendly neutrality. He's staying neutral, but his neutrality helps Putin because he's protecting him. He doesn't have months to work this out. He's only got weeks to work it out. Usually when leaders have to take these big geopolitical decisions, they have years or at least months to make them. He's got about 2 weeks before things in Ukraine reach a really critical stage. And he's got to decide, is he going to back Putin and back all that that's going to involve, be complicit in these barbaric attacks, and do himself quite a lot of harm, or is he actually going to emerge as the peacemaker, the statesman of the world, who is the one person who could stop this war? Because if Xi Jinping says to Putin it's over, then it probably will.
OK, we're going to address that issue more deeply a little bit later on. Let's ask more about the conflict, though. And what are the chances that Russia might attack nearby countries not in NATO, such as Moldova? That from Ewan. Now, Moldova there, kind of sandwiched between Ukraine and the European Union. We know that it's on Putin's list, so to speak.
Well, it may be. It's only 30 miles west of Odessa. And so if the Russians get to Odessa, which will be quite an if at the moment, but if they get to Odessa, then the temptation will be to go another 30 miles, because just over the border in Moldova is Transnistria, which is a self-declared Russian republic. It's the old base of the Red Army, the 14th Army in the old Red Army. And so a lot of very determined Russians live there, and they've basically declared independent. They have their own currency. They have plastic coins because they can't afford real coins, so they have plastic money. But you know, it works. And so you've got this group who are like a mini Donbass, a mini separatists, and and there's 1,000 Russian troops there. I mean, we think there's more than 1,000, but officially there's 1,000 Russian troops plus a lot of separatists in Transnistria, in Moldova. The general view is if the Russians moved against Moldova, Moldova would actually fall apart quite quickly, because it's a poor state, and it's a small state, and it's ethnically more or less Romanian, actually. But that would certainly be at risk, but so would the Baltics. If we're right, and I hope we're not, but if we're right that Mr. Putin is trying to make this war more general, to actually make it bigger, because he's trying to retrieve the blunder of making the war in the first place, then the Baltics are vulnerable. Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania. And the possibility, there's a piece of Russia in Lithuania on the Baltic coast, right? Kaliningrad. It's a piece of Russia detached from the rest of Russia. And there's an area called the Suwalki Corridor, or the Suwalki Gap, about 40, 50 miles long, 30 miles wide, which would join Lithuania and Belarus and cut the Baltics off from road reinforcement, so that the Baltics could only be reinforced by NATO by air or by sea in the Baltics.
So watch out for that. Last question on this section concerning Belarus, and this is about the reinforcements. As we know, they're taking these terrible losses, the Russians. How likely is it that the Belarusian military will enter the war, and what might the likely impact be if they do? And there's President Lukashenko of Belarus. We know he's been summoned in the past for talks with Putin in Moscow, hasn't he?
Yeah, Lukashenko, he's been doing a sort of diplomatic okey-dokey. I mean, first of all, he was absolutely in, and he was making it very clear to his people that we're all part of this. This is great. When it went wrong, he was out, and so he then tried to reassure everyone in Belarus that Belarusian troops are not involved, even if Belarusian territory is involved in some of the air defence which the Russians are using. So then they're out. Now he's under great pressure to go back in again. And we know from intelligence reports which have been shared that a lot of Belarusian soldiers are deserting because they're actually being lined up to cross the border. And all these armies, they lose people like there's no tomorrow when they think they're going into battle. So the Belarusians may be forced to go across the border because the Russians are seriously running short of troops to get this next phase of their battle completed, where they just need to overwhelm the Ukrainian forces until they crack as formed units. That's the next phase for them. Whether they will or not, I don't know. But they've committed all the 190,000 that they prepared for this, and they're now short of troops.
Keep an eye on the Belarusians. OK, Michael, thank you very much indeed for this section. You're watching the Sky News question and answer special on the war in Ukraine. Next, how might the conflict in Ukraine draw to a conclusion? We'll be talking what the possible end game of the war in Ukraine could look like with Michael Clarke.
They have breached the road. There is a lot of gas being fired all around us. It is an absolute carnival kind of atmosphere out here for Prime Minister Modi's decisive victory. These students are defying the prohibitory order, and now they're going to be arrested.
We aim to be the best and most trusted place for news. The roads have been inundated. The only way out is to get people by boat. This on any given day would have been bustling with people, but today it's absolutely deserted. I'm Neville Lazarus, and I'm Sky's reporter based in Delhi.
Welcome back to our question and answer special on Ukraine. Now, in the time we've got left, let's take a look at how the war in Ukraine might end with our defence and security analyst, Professor Michael Clarke. Got a question from Stuart, says, how long can Russia sustain its military campaign financially? And I suppose that takes in the loss of men and equipment as well.
Yes, I mean, in terms of direct costs, it's more or less self-financing this war because of the increase in energy prices. So most analysts say it's costing them about $1 billion a day to run this war, but they're taking in almost $1 billion a day in energy income. So the war itself, and they'll take in more as energy prices go higher. So direct costs, not such a big problem for them. But the indirect costs, of course, are huge because it looks as if the Russian economy is going to shrink by between 12 and 15% as a result of this war. And that's a great deal more than it shrank by in the 1998 financial crisis, 2008 financial crisis or the COVID crisis.
But we hear talk of Russia defaulting on some of its loans as soon as the middle of this week.
That's right. They're about to default. What they're actually going to do, they're going to pay their interest in rubles, which nobody wants. Now, technically, they're allowed to do that, but financially, nobody will take it seriously. So it means that they've been downgraded to junk status. So all of their bonds are junk status now. S&Ps and all of the ratings agencies, Standard & Poor's, they've just downgraded all their bonds.
Yeah, OK, well, we're talking about how this war might end. Let's look at this route, which is the preferred Russian route we know from day one of this war. Rosie asks, what would happen if President Zielinski were killed by the Russian army or by Russian irregulars, by Chechens, we understand, launched some assassination attempts, according to President Zielinski, in the first few weeks. I mean, what would happen if the Russians, as they want to do, took him out?
For sure. I mean, if the Russians got hold of Zelensky, they will kill him, for sure. They won't let him survive because he'll be a figurehead and so on. However, the Ukrainians, on Western advice, some time ago created a very long succession list. Now, we don't know who's on that list, but one assumes that the Prime Minister is, and probably the Defence Minister. So if Zelensky were killed, then immediately there would be a new leader, whether that person will become the President or just be the Prime Minister, Defence Minister, whatever it is. But they have a long succession list. And I have to say, I mean, 3 weeks ago, I thought that Mr. Zelensky would be lucky to stay alive for the next couple of weeks, when we thought the Russians would be able to take Kiev quite quickly. The situation in the war now is, I think he's got a better than evens chance of being there when Putin falls.
Mm-hmm. Well, let's look lastly then at what everyone's hoping for, some kind of diplomatic solution to the crisis. And that's the question from Soren there. How likely is a diplomatic solution to the crisis? Our picture there shows the presidents, Biden and Putin, but I think, as we touched on earlier in this hour, Michael, perhaps Xi Jinping should be in there as well.
For sure. He's the one person who could, as it were, create the impetus for a diplomatic solution. And the Ukrainians, of course, they're on a hiding to nothing in one sense. I mean, Golda Meir, the Israeli Prime Minister in '67, she said, you can't negotiate with somebody trying to kill you, which is what this started as. However, if the Russians are looking for a way out of some sort, then there may be some sort of negotiation. And the point about the Ukrainians is that they won't want to negotiate for their own removal as a state. But they can keep negotiations going, maybe for some months, so they live to fight another day. And in this sort of situation, when things are happening so quickly, if you can buy a ceasefire that lasts a few months, then you do live to fight another day. And what the Ukrainians are saying is, look, we're negotiating, but we're still fighting. So they say, we'll talk as if we are not fighting, and we will fight as if we're not talking.
But if we get to that, how do we, the West, how do we deal with Putin after this? How do we trust anything he says, anything he signs?
We don't. We have to say to Putin, look, this has been a huge strategic mistake. You or people around you have got to realise this. We will help you get out of it. We'll help you, go out of this situation, climb down. But nothing will be the same again, Mr. Putin. You cannot go back to zero before the 24th of February. So everything is different now. And if you're prepared to withdraw from Ukraine, and we'll maybe discuss something on the basis of the Austrian State Treaty of 1955, which is a treaty of neutrality, which the Soviet Union accepted for Austria, might be a model that we could talk about. The Ukrainians say they won't, but I bet they would if it created a ceasefire. So let's think of some devices to help you climb down. But don't believe, Mr. Putin, that you can ever get back where you were in world politics before this war started.
Professor Michael Clarke, thank you so much. What a productive and insightful hour we have had. And thank you for answering so many of those questions. And thank you to everyone who sent those questions in on the war in Ukraine for this Sky News special. Now, coming up in the next hour, a curfew has been imposed on Ukraine's capital, Kiev, until Thursday, as the mayor of the city has warned of difficult hours to come.